Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Ari Freiberg, Academic Advisor to the National Regulators Community of Practice and Subject Leader for Governing by the Rules, which is the law and regulation subject in ANZOG's Executive Master of Public Administration. And on behalf of ANZOG and the NRCoP, I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar entitled Making Use of Old Tools, Registering, Licensing, Permitting, Accrediting, Certifying, and so many more. We've got participants from different parts of the world at this webinar, so I'd like to begin first by acknowledging all First Peoples here today, pay my respects to them and to their forebears. We honour your wisdom and your stewardship of traditional lands and seas and your customs which enrich us all. However, before I introduce my fellow speakers, some housekeeping. For your colleagues who may have missed today, all the NRCoP webinars are recorded and available on the ANZOG YouTube channel within 14 days. And today, as always, we'll be using the free Slido app for your questions and comments, and also for a quick poll, which I'll get to shortly. On your phone or device, enter Slido into your browser and then hashtag AllTools as your event code. And you can start asking questions immediately, and you can like other people's. Who will you be hearing from today? Well, Jenness Gardner. She's the CEO of the Economic Regulation Authority in Western Australia and is currently on leave of absence from her role as convener of the WA chapter committee. Jenness joined the ERA as CEO, I love acronyms, in November 2017, having worked extensively in the state and Commonwealth governments. Jenness has significant experience working in the resources sector, leading economic policy development, commercial negotiations, and large-scale project development for Western Australia. Kerry Melkerson is the Executive Director of Occupational Health and Hygiene for Resources, Safety and Health Queensland, the regulator responsible for safety and health in Queensland's mining, quarrying, explosive and petroleum and gas industries. And with over 16 years experience in occupational and latent onset injury and illness, Kerry leads the team responsible for reforms in health surveillance across the sectors following the re-identification of miners' black lung in 2015. Now, today, I'm going to start us off with an overview of what I've called authorisation as regulation. Why these tools are so enduringly popular despite the best efforts of business and deregulatory competition forces to kill them off. Now, I've called my presentation There's No Tool Like an Old Tool, and no, that's not self-referential. Then we're going to have a look at two case studies of the good, the bad, and the downright embarrassing. Jenness's review of WA's business licensing regime gives us an insight into what can go wrong if you neglect your regulatory housekeeping. In contrast, Kerry's work to prevent and detect miners' black lung is testimonial to why regulators continue to use authorisation as a critical way to change behaviour and assure quality. However, first, as promised, it's over to you, and we're going to run a quick poll, which is about you as the subject of regulation rather than as regulating others. So we've got the poll questions, and as you may see, what I want you to do is to tick, and you can tick more than one if you're happy to confess them. Have you ever been jailed for a crime? Now be honest here. Fined by a court, received an infringement notice, held a driver's license, held an occupational or professional license, had your pet registered, or studied an accredited tertiary institution? So answer it honestly. It's Chatham House rules. We won't tell anyone where you've been, what you've done, and what your future might be in the public service. So we're getting the results in, they're coming in slowly, and what we can see is, well, for a criminologist, it's very disappointing that the jail sentences here are not scoring very well. However, pets are coming in fourth, and infringement notice. Remember, parking fine, speeding fine, doing something that you should not have done, but have had to pay a small financial penalty. So most of you can drive, which is good. most of you have got a tertiary education, which is good, or at least studied at one with a accreditation. A lot of you are minor lawbreakers, but I won't hold that against you. Pet owners, we want to ask about dogs and cats, and quite a number of you have got a professional license. And fined by a court, 1. Well, that's not too bad. You've been reasonably honest there. Anyway, what we can see is that a vast majority of you have some form of authorization in what you do. Very few have been at the top end of that Braithwaite pyramid, the enforcement, and been fined or jailed. Now, these poll results shouldn't be a surprise to you. The authorization process is a very, very old story. Now, some of you may remember back to 1066 and all that, when the Normans conquered England, and one of the first things they did was to complete what was called the Domesday Book, a massive land and property register which helped the new ruler levy taxes. Nothing new there. Births, deaths and marriages and land have been registered in some way from the earliest times, I think primarily to help Ancestry.com, but even then it had some good uses. Or cast your mind back to medieval England, when cities and the crown authorised guilds or cartels in the modern language for cordwainers, weavers, butchers, barbers, brewers, bakers, tailors and assorted other occupations. They were the forerunners of our current occupational restrictions on practice. You may ask yourself, whatever did happen to those cordwainers? Did you know that Manolo Blahnik is a cordwainer? There you are. If nothing else, you can take that away from today's seminar. And talking of noxious or problematic people, we have over the years licensed cattle slaughterers, hawkers and peddlers, pawnbrokers, money lenders, prostitutes. We've licensed various occupations such as innkeepers, bakers, second-hand dealers, real estate agents, not to mention dangerous professions such as doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, dentists, and more recently, other people who mess around with our bodies in new and exciting ways. Today in New South Wales, or at least a few years ago, there were 20.7 million licences in force at a state level and over 1 million licences at a local government level. New South Wales government agencies collected over 2.8 billion in licence fees. Clearly, licensing is a good business. A 2013 report by the former Competition and Efficiency Commission in Victoria documented 390 different types of Victorian government permits, licences, approvals, certifications or registrations. Over 2.1 million were issued or renewed in 2011-12, and the government of Victoria collected 535 million in licence or registration fees. So, clearly, very persuasive, very pervasive, very good for government. Now, what do we mean by the term authorisation? Well, I've used it to cover licences, registrations, notifications, authorisations, accreditation, permits, approvals and certifications. And the various tools differ along many dimensions, such as areas of control, for example, persons, premises, places, products, entities, activities, public resources. It can vary by time, such as the length of authorisation, and by the authorising body, whether it be public or private. So, why, in the light of all of the new regulatory tools such as nudging, behavioural insights, sandboxes, augmented decision-making or artificial intelligence, big data, blockchains, all of these modern, new, flashy tools, why do the ancient tools such as licensing and registration remain so popular? And why do they persist and flourish in the face of multiple attempts to remove them due to their cost and the regulatory burdens that they impose and which are so frequently complained of? Why recently, when considering banning artificial stone bench tops because of the dangers of silicosis, did a national task force consider the merits of licensing instead of a total ban? Why, a couple of months ago in Victoria, when media investigations about private alcohol and other treatment providers showed that some of them were misrepresenting the services they offered, charged exorbitant fees and treated people poorly, why was there a call for a mandatory registration and licensing scheme? Well, I think there are many reasons why authority tools are so persistent, pervasive and powerful, and why governments turn to them so often, so frequently when considering a new program, or, as is often the case, as a first response to a regulatory crisis. Well, first, they acknowledge and reinforce the fact that governments have the ultimate authority to allow or disallow various forms of conduct. And the exercise of that power serves as a reminder of the continuing centrality of the state in the management of economic and social relations, despite the growing recognition of other forms of non-state regulatory measures. Self-regulation and co-regulation have their places, but it's a second place. Second, authorisation is a primary means of addressing information asymmetries. Governments like and need to know what their citizens are doing, where and when. Authorisation, such as registration, facilitates enforcement by requiring details of the licensee or registrant and their activities, and also by mandating standards required for entry into professions or occupations. The government addresses information asymmetries by, in effect, warranting that the holder of the authorisation possesses the requisite skills or knowledge that the consumer requires. Requiring minimum standards narrows the information gap, and the process of authorisation relieves the consumer of the need to either personally obtain those skills or verify that they exist. Third, authorisation permits regulators to control the amount, duration and place at which activities may occur, some that may disturb the peace or otherwise cause harm to others. Fourth, authorisation mechanisms are among the most significant means by which an environment of trust can be created and maintained. Licenses, certificates or permits can be regarded as what I've called tokens of trust issued by governments and other bodies, enabling people like you and me to go about our daily lives without the need to verify independently the qualifications of the people they deal with, the safety of the items they consume, or the instruments that they use. Fifth, authorisation is an essential element in risk management. As a preventive regulatory tool, it seeks to minimise the risk of harm by attempting to ensure that those who engage in possibly harmful activities are properly trained and skilled. Authorisation is a form of standard setting. The higher the standard, the more rigorously it is enforced, the lower the risk of harm. And risk may also be managed by limiting the conduct of licensees, introducing requirements, for example, to conform to industry codes, standards or guidelines, and imposing insolvency requirements. Sixth, an authorisation scheme can provide redress via the establishment of a complaints handling or dispute resolution process, mechanisms for the imposition of administrative or criminal sanctions or remedies, and requirements for taking out insurance policies or the creation of trust or compensation funds. All of these may provide a consumer with some avenue of complaint or form of redress. And finally, authorisations are one of the few regulatory tools that in theory can be self-funding. For that reason, they're highly attractive to governments. Where licenses are used to allocate scarce resources, for example, radio spectrum, they can result in significant financial gain to governments. And did I mention that such schemes provide bountiful employment opportunities for regulators, such as yourself? Authorisations require authorisers to approve, register, monitor compliance, detect and respond to contraventions, vary, cancel, suspend or revoke licence, or disqualify their holders. Good news for regulators. However, all is not rosy in this regulatory cornucopia. Because on the other side, authorisations impose burdens on regulatees, and they are a perennial source of complaint by businesses, both large and small. The complaints cover issues such as whether an authorisation should at all be required for the activity, the cost of applying for one, the time taken both to apply and receive it, to renew it, the frequency with which it has to be renewed, the onerous conditions that might be attached, and the need to obtain a separate authorisation in each jurisdiction. For those watching in New Zealand, not a problem for you. They also have the effect, as economists will tell us, of restricting competition where they limit access to an activity or a profession or occupation. Competition policies acknowledge the tension between the need to protect consumers and the desire to ensure that goods and services are delivered at the lowest cost and with the greatest efficiency. Authorisation tools have the potential to blunt the advantageous effects of competition on price, quantity, and the quality of goods and services. Quantitative limits on providers serve to restrict competition without necessarily benefiting consumers. And by restricting access to markets, some forms of authorisation can inhibit innovation, which in the longer term can act to the detriment of consumers. Licensing may also encourage regulatory capture, which occurs when too close a relationship develops between the regulator and the regulatee, to the advantage of the latter and to the detriment of the community in whose interests the regulators are meant to protect. Now, some problems can be dealt with more easily than others. Renewal periods can be increased. The application and renewal process can be simplified. Fees decreased. Automatic mutual recognition can decrease the cost of movement between jurisdictions in Australia's blessed federal system. Reporting requirements can be eased, and I know that the federal government is working at the moment on easing the mutual recognition requirements. So where are we now? Despite their cost, intrusiveness, and regulatory burdens that they impose, their flexibility and potential for cost recovery make authority tools highly attractive to governments. And notwithstanding the obvious restraints on competition, the possible increases in cost, and sometimes the terrible clunkiness of their implementation, the public interest in regulation often outweighs market considerations. In Anzog's words, they still produce public value. Now, over the past 30 years or so, authorising activities have expanded from predominantly state-based verification systems to those that involve the private sector or non-government sector through accreditation and certification processes at local, national and transnational levels. And with the ostensible decentering of the state in regulation and the increased involvement of private parties in regulation, systems of certifications and accreditation have grown. The development of private forms of private certification and regulation regimes, nationally and internationally, has had the effect of increasing the scope of regulation beyond the state without necessarily decreasing the regulatory burden on organisations. And with the growth of digital technologies and other forms of information generation, individuals and organisations may well become less reliant on governments to redress information asymmetries and make people more willing to trust other sources of information, such as social media, commercial organisations and peer-to-peer platforms. Think, for example, of the increasing use of Expedia, TripAdvisor, My School, Good Universities Guide, and most importantly, the Good Food Guide, amongst others. In its examination of the disruptive effects of the digital economy, the Australian Productivity Commission suggested that in areas such as occupational licensing, information asymmetries may be overcome by digital platforms, thus reducing the need or the scope of government licensing or accreditation scheme. Of course, this will only work as long as the information provided is accurate and unbiased and the risks of harm are not large. Well, they get rid of Twitter and Facebook, but other than that, we're fine. Maybe the future is more rosy. So, look, where does this leave us? Now, if you look at this slide, which was prepared for IPART in New South Wales, the regulatory authority there by PricewaterhouseCoopers, it's a useful, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's a 4-stage analysis. And if you're a regulator facing a new problem or managing an existing scheme, perhaps this licensing framework developed by PricewaterhouseCoopers might help you. It asks the questions, is licensing appropriate at all? If you've got a new problem, like the silicon benchtops, like new activities that are coming on in terms of financial regulation, is it appropriate? Is it something that you need, or is some other mechanism better to address the problem if the state needs to be involved? The second question is it well designed? Is it the minimum necessary? Is it the license for the shortest possible period? Are you administering it effectively? Are you efficient? Do people know what you're doing, what they're doing? Is the information collected what you need? And is it the best response? Is it the best way? And you've got to keep reassessing that, as is often done. So I'll leave you with that particular slide to think about. It's going to be provided to you. And I notice now that my social license and permission and authorisation to talk to you has now expired. And it's time to cross to Western Australia, where Jenness Gardner will tell us about her review of WA's business licensing scheme and why it was a renovator's opportunity. Jenness.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today, and I really appreciated Ari's introduction, because I think it picks up a lot of the themes of the work that we've also have done. But I'll start with an acknowledgement of country. So I'm presenting from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The piece of work that I'm going to outline to you today is something we did a little while ago, but we remain very proud of. As well as being the state's utility regulator, the Economic Regulation Authority in Western Australia can be asked by the Treasurer to conduct inquiries into matters of economic importance. These can be as routine as looking at the efficiency of water and electricity tariffs, or as obscure as reviewing the effectiveness of WA's chicken meat industry, both things that we've actually reviewed. However, in 2017, the ERA was asked to conduct an inquiry into the reform of business and occupational licensing in Western Australia. We delivered the final report to government in February 2019. The report contained 15 recommendations, and it focused on fixing 3 key problems, which are going to be eerily familiar to the themes that Ari touched on in his presentation a moment ago. The first of these is an absence of a culture of active management and improvement across regulatory agencies. So we have no central register of all state government business licensing schemes, and agencies can take quite different approaches to administering, monitoring and improving business licensing. There's a low prioritisation of review and reform initiatives, and unfortunately a lack of awareness and community insight into the costs and the benefits of licensing. Not all licences established under state government legislation are administered by state government agencies. So, for example, local government administers some schemes, and businesses are also subject to licences established under commonwealth legislation, local government laws and voluntary industry arrangements. I'm going to move now to our findings. As you can see, there were around 700 state government licensing schemes. So a bit like the outline that Ari was giving of the plethora of schemes that are in New South Wales and Victoria, we too have a lot of them. We have 43 different agencies with responsibility for business licensing. And there were 200 schemes with no information on the relevant agency website. So they'll say that again, no information on the relevant agency website. So this includes that there being no information online or applications not being able to be completed or paid for online. In many cases, licence applications had to be posted in or actually even handed into the agency. While at some instances this makes some sense, so for example with firearms licences, for many others it just doesn't. 2 million business licences are on issue in Western Australia, and 1/5 of WA's legislation establishes at least one licensing scheme. So these numbers were correct as of 2019, and I'd expect that there's been some improvements by specific agencies since then. So it gives you a bit of a snapshot of what we were looking at the time. I'm going to move on now to what we've titled the horror stories. One of our most enthusiastic readers, Monica Pfeffer, and hello to you, Monica, I know you're just off screen, was particularly taken by some of the horror stories of outdated licensing schemes that we found. So that's the title of these slides. First of all, many licensing schemes had actually never been reviewed. For those that have been reviewed, 60% of schemes have not had their policy purpose reviewed in 10 years. So no one knows if it is still a relevant purpose. 70% of schemes had not had their enforcement or compliance reviewed in 6 years. And even when schemes are reviewed, changes are just not flowing through the system. So 40% of the schemes that have been reviewed in the past 6 years had none of the recommendations implemented. We provided government with a set of lists of all the licensing schemes that fit these categories and suggested that they could start there for some quick wins. So some of the examples of schemes that had not been reviewed in more than 10 years included offshore mining licences, fuel pipeline licences, dredging and reclamation licences for waterways, the casino liquor licence that hadn't been reviewed for more than 20 years. I'm sure it'll come up as part of the casino gaming licence being subject to a Royal Commission here in WA. Bookmakers licensing scheme had never been reviewed, again, despite changes to online betting and things like that. The debt collectors licence scheme has never been reviewed. Charity collectors licence had never been reviewed, despite massive changes in how donations are received. And security licences, so licences for bodyguards, security officers and the installation of security systems hadn't been reviewed in more than 10 years. There's evidence as well that some agencies have fewer resources available for compliance monitoring than either they used to have in the past or when compared to other jurisdictions. So, for example, in 2017, WorkSafe, the Western Australian organisation responsible for enforcing occupational health and safety and investigating workplace deaths and accidents, had just 93 inspectors. So this meant that Western Australia had the lowest rate of inspectors per 10,000 employees across Australia. The Department of Health Radiation Health Unit, which provides support services to the Radiological Council, had halved from 17 officers in 1998 to 9 in 2018, while the number of facilities and individuals requiring authorisation had increased. The Master Painters and Decorators of Australia told the inquiry that when the Painters Registration Scheme was enforced by the Painters Registration Board, which was prior to 2011, there were up to 5 inspectors, but that now there was only 1 desk-based inspector with expertise in painting. And for building inspections, the Auditor General found that the Building Commission's program of audit was not supported by sound risk assessment to help target resources. The Building Commission was not gathering local government reports on inspections. It was not referring non-compliant builders to local governments in a timely way, and it was not following up with local governments on referrals. I'll now move to put WA in context with the rest of Australia and comment a little bit about how we compare with what we call over east, and hello to you on the other side of the rabbit-proof fence. Largely, we found that WA has a similar set of licensing schemes to those of most Australian states. Every industry in Western Australia is regulated by at least one business licensing scheme, and business licensing in Western Australia is pretty varied and far-reaching, a bit like the circumstance that Ari was talking about. So it covers everything from driving, teacher registrations, kangaroo shooting and cat breeding. And there are still examples of licensing schemes in WA that might create unnecessary barriers to market participation. A couple of the ones that we identified, for example, was that Western Australia is the only jurisdiction to continue to license real estate developers, and it's one of very few jurisdictions to license land valuers, employment agents, and motor vehicle repairers and salespeople. So I've talked now about some of the gaps, I suppose. I'd like to move to talking about some positive stories. Who did we find who were doing things well? So we looked, as part of the report, we looked at examples of who's doing business licensing well, and we looked generally across both nationally, internationally, as well as in Western Australia. One of our findings was that the consumer voice is absent from licensing and regulation, and we recommended that the state government establish a central consultation site for all government consultation processes. We noted that the Australian Energy Regulator has established what it called a Consumer Challenge Panel in 2013 after recognising that consumer engagement in its regulatory processes was limited. But they didn't stop there. In 2016, after 3 years of their Consumer Challenge Panel operating, the AER commissioned an independent review of the effectiveness of the panel. This review noted that the technical and complex nature of the regulatory framework made it difficult for consumers and their representatives to contribute, and that existing consumer organisations did not have the resources to overcome these challenges. The review supported the ongoing operation of the panel, but it made some recommendations for improvement, and these recommendations were accepted by the AER. Since we've completed the inquiry, I've also noted that the AER is continuing to review and update and modernise and refresh the way that their consumer challenge panel operates. So not only did they put in place a panel to improve consumer engagement in a technically challenging area, they followed through with the continual review and improvement of the initial idea as well. Another example of places doing it well was British Columbia. In the 1990s, economic growth and employment in British Columbia was lower than in other parts of Canada. Excessive regulation was often cited as a major contributor to this underperformance. In 2001, the British Columbia government established a red tape reduction task force, a net zero increase regulation target, and an online platform for the public to provide suggestions for regulatory improvement. In its first year, the Red Tape Reduction Task Force received 600 proposals for reducing red tape on businesses. Subsequent reforms halved the number of regulatory requirements over the years between 2001 and 2017 and reduced compliance costs for citizens. The regulatory regime is now highly rated by businesses in Canada. Between 2012 and 2017, the government earned an A grade each year, which was unmatched by other provinces, from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. So while other factors were at play in British Columbia's economic turnaround, many in the private sector credit red tape reduction with playing a critical role. I'll now move on to talking about the recommendations, and I've got a couple of slides here. I won't go through all 15 of our recommendations, but to talk more generally about the theme through them all. And that central theme is that licensing schemes should be managed as public assets, with a continual review and improvement process and an ongoing consideration of the costs and the benefits. We think this should be similar to the upkeep that would be given to any other piece of public infrastructure. We didn't just recommend red tape reduction if we felt that was a bit of a blunt instrument that wasn't addressing the real issue, which is about keeping licensing current and fit for purpose. There was a reason the licence was put in place in the first instance. As Ari's outlined, sometimes this purpose no longer justifies the ongoing existence of a licence, but often the underlying rationale remains. So it's more about ensuring that the licence delivers the outcome intended in the best way. We found so much valuable information was already in existence from regulators and licensing agencies across Australia, but particularly actually just within Western Australia, and it just wasn't being shared or adopted across government. The ERA's recommendations were intended to lift the profile of licensing within government through the appointment of a dedicated minister and resourcing of the existing Better Regulation Unit within the Department of Treasury to provide more services to agencies, a sort of licensing flying squad that could provide resources, advise on best practice and conduct reviews. So as I said in my introduction, the ERA's recommendations shaped around three central points: the absence of a culture of active management and improvement, low prioritisation, and a lack of awareness and community insights into the costs and benefits of licensing. Our recommendations seek to directly address these problems. The recommendation of a dedicated minister who'd be accountable for implementing and reviewing a governance framework for licensing, assessing duplication and reviewing regulatory gaps in the cumulative regulatory burden would raise the priority of licensing in Cabinet and Parliament. With an annual omnibus bill would provide a vehicle for many minor legislative changes needed to implement improvements to licensing schemes. So things like removing the requirement for applications to be faxed in or have a wet signature. Small changes that take parliamentary time but make a massive cumulative difference in the efficient operation of a licensing scheme. And we felt that the public reporting through Treasury on licensing scheme performance and the regulatory impact assessment process would provide an incentive for agencies to improve their performance. So what happened to the report? Well, just 2 years on from the report, there was no formal response from government. Our Act doesn't actually require that government has to accept or refuse our recommendations. Our report was folded into a regulatory reform process called Streamline WA, and that was announced in the final months of our inquiry. And some of the central themes of our recommendations have been picked up. Streamline WA approach supported several of the ERA's recommendations, including managing licensing scheme as public assets, using senior leadership within government to drive regulatory reform, and developing a whole of government regulatory framework. Like many other places in Australia, we've seen a lot of work in the post-COVID economic recovery, and there's a lot of reforms that have been processed and progressed through that, including supporting local governments to reduce approval times and costs to small business, simplifying mining and tourism approvals, and removing duplication and improving transparency for environmental reporting. In closing, I think there are still barriers to reform remaining. Reviewing and making change to licensing schemes costs agencies time and money, and governments unfortunately focus too much on the price of doing something as opposed to the cost of doing nothing. In WA, we don't have a systematic framework for the management of established schemes, and agencies still don't really know how to conduct a review and evaluate it. It just leaves each agency individually to develop its own capability. Also, to most people and most ministers, licensing is not particularly sexy. While the general public cares when something goes catastrophically wrong, it can be hard to get sustained political traction needed to recreate change and reform. And licensing has to compete to make it to the parliamentary agenda. So it's still a live issue here in WA. We've also seen that with COVID that you can see a crisis enabling large-scale change to happen rapidly. And some improvements to licensing schemes occurred through these changes. But what we think really is still most needed is the ongoing maintenance program through frequent incremental change. And we argue that this remains the key to enabling business licensing to remain modern and create better outcomes for consumers, licensees and the environment. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Jenness, for that presentation and that insight from WA, where the rabbits don't roam. And yet, when disaster strikes, we keep going back to the same tools. Kerry's going to talk to us about the approach of the Queensland Resources, Safety and Health Regulators to detecting miners' black lung disease. You'll recognise a familiar basket of measures and no surprises, complaints of a regulatory burden and excessive cost. Kerry.
Thank you for that introduction, Ari, and I'm hoping that everybody can see my slides up on the screen now. So as stated, my name is Kerry Melkishen and I'm the Executive Director of Occupational Health and Hygiene for the relatively newly formed statutory body Resources, Safety and Health Queensland, or RSHQ. So we were formerly part of the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy. And we provide regulation or oversight in the safety and health of Queensland's coal mines, mineral mines and quarries, petroleum and gas and explosives industries. And I'm here today to talk to you about our rather recent foray into licensing as a form of regulation. And by licensing, I actually mean the registration of medical providers to undertake a scheme function under the Coal Mine Workers Health Scheme. And the Coal Mine Workers Health Scheme is responsible for health surveillance and fitness for work provisions for Queensland's coal miners, both upon entry into the industry and then periodically thereafter. So why did we move into licensing? Well, on the 13th of May 2015, the first case of coal workers' pneumoconiosis or black lung in nearly 30 years was reported to the then department. And coal workers' pneumoconiosis or black lung was a condition that was thought to have been eradicated in Queensland. And what ensued was nearly 2 years worth of state and federal parliamentary inquiries and a review into the respiratory component of the scheme by the Monash University and the University of Illinois in Chicago. And what that uncovered was systemic failure across industry, the regulator and the medical fraternity. So for industry, it was their management and control of dust. For the regulator, it was our storage of health records and our oversight of the scheme. And for the medical fraternity, it was extremely poor quality chest X-ray films. It was radiologists who were failing to detect pneumoconiosis on those images. It was extremely poor quality spirometry, so the taking of lung function for those assessments. And then there was a limited understanding of the supervising doctors who were signing off on these health assessments on occupational dust disease, and also a limited understanding of the mining environment itself. And unfortunately, since that time, there have now been 210 individuals who have been diagnosed with some form of dust disease or mine dust lung disease, and 125 of those are actually cases of pneumoconiosis like black lung. So Jenness, I'm going to raise you for your number of recommendations, because out of the reviews that were undertaken of our scheme, there were 68 recommendations that came out of the CWP Select Committee, and 18 recommendations that came from the Monash review. And I'm going to focus on 3 of the recommendations that came out of the Monash review because it's relevant to our discussion today. So recommendation 7 was that there needed to be a much smaller pool of doctors who were performing these assessments under the scheme. Recommendation 8 was that those doctors needed to subject themselves to ongoing training and they needed to become more proficient in being able to perform this type of health surveillance. And then finally, recommendation 9 was that there needed to be a register of doctors and this register needed to be the sole responsibility of the then department. So what did we do? Well, we started off as any regulator usually does, and that is we started to establish standards. So in the first instance, we established standards for the taking of chest x-rays. We established standards for the taking of spirometry for coal mine workers under our scheme. We then mandated the use of the ILO classification system. And the ILO classification system is an internationally recognised system of being able to classify plain chest x-ray for the purposes of detecting pneumoconiosis. And we also mandated that all x-rays needed to be dual read to these standards by expert B-reader radiologists. So radiologists who had undertaken particular training to become proficient in using these standards. So we then moved to developing a registration process for all of the medical providers that are performing services under our scheme. And those medical providers included examining medical officers. So as the name suggests, they're the doctors that actually examine the coal mine worker. The supervising doctors who sign off on the health assessments, x-ray providers who are actually taking the x-rays, the B-reader radiologists that are reading the x-rays, and the spirometry providers and the training organisations to actually train the individuals to take spirometry. So part of that registration process included the need for ongoing training. The supervising doctors needed to visit mine sites periodically so that they could actually have an understanding of that environment that they're sending workers into to work. They needed to undertake minimum numbers of health assessments or minimum numbers of x-rays to be read to be able to maintain that proficiency. They had to subject themselves to audit, and the conditions of approval for these medical providers also included a need to liaise with RSHQ in a timely manner. So for example, historically, if we had had questions about a health assessment that had been performed and we tried to reach out to a supervising doctor, often we'd be met with radio silence, whereas now it's part of the conditions of their approval that they have to communicate with us in a timely manner, so in a set number of days, so that we could discuss that health assessment. So the actual accreditation of these medical providers, we've outsourced that to a provider. But the final decision about whether or not they become part of the register for RSHQ is that RSHQ is the decision maker, and that's when we apply our fit and proper test. So there's obvious overlays with other regulators when it comes to working in this medical space, and the obvious one would be the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Agency, or AHPRA. So AHPRA may make a decision about a doctor and advise that they're able to continue to keep practicing with certain restrictions, but we need to satisfy ourselves that that's appropriate for the purposes of our scheme as well. As you can appreciate, mining is a hazardous environment, and decisions made about the fitness and health of an individual can impact not only their safety and health, but the safety and health of their peers in that hazardous environment. So for example, AHPRA may make a decision that it's completely appropriate for a medical provider to continue to keep practicing with restrictions, say if they've had drug charges brought against them. So they've been inappropriately prescribing drugs to either to themselves or to another party. So we need to look at that and decide whether or not it's appropriate that under those restrictions, so AHPRA may say that they need to subject themselves to random drug tests, they have to undergo counselling, have a mentor, etc. We need to decide whether or not we're satisfied with that, and that this is a doctor that's going to make decisions about the safety and health of a person in a hazardous environment, and whether or not we're comfortable with that, considering the exercising of quite poor judgment in the past by that individual. So we've certainly show-caused doctors under our registration, our register, But what we've found thus far is that doctors are more likely to surrender their registration rather than allowing RSHQ to actually make a decision about whether or not they should remain on our register. So therefore our application of that fit and proper test hasn't been properly tested as yet at QCAT, the Civil and Administrative Tribunal. So our register had a transitional period. So the graph that you can see on the left is displaying what that journey has actually looked like for the register. So around the time that coal workers pneumoconiosis was re-identified back in 2015, we had over 230 doctors who were performing that task of the supervising doctor. So the ultimate responsibility of signing off on a health assessment. We then moved to a voluntary register, which did have some of those provisions and sort of tests that they needed to meet, and we found that the number of doctors dropped down to just over 100. The register became mandatory on the 1st of March this year, with all the requirements of the accreditation, the costs associated with that, etc. And the number of doctors who are now registered as supervising doctors at the 1st of March dropped to 66. So as you can see, this adoption of this registration or licensing process has actually had the desired effect for recommendation 7 of a much smaller pool of doctors who are appropriately trained and have the adequate proficiency to be performing this well. You can see with the map on the right-hand side that gives an overview of all of the provider types that perform services under our scheme. So that's examining doctors, supervising doctors, radiologists, X-ray providers, spirometry providers and training organisations. And so pre the mandatory register, we were sitting at about 800 providers performing those services. When the register became mandatory, dropped down to about 500. But we're still satisfied we've got appropriate coverage across the state and regionally for the between 16,000 to 50,000 health assessments that occur each year. So just to touch very quickly on some of our lessons, highly prescriptive health regulation is not without risk. So you need to make sure that if you're setting the standards, for example, with X-rays and spirometry, that they actually maintain their currency and that, they are best practice. And you definitely need to be mindful of any new position statements from medical experts out there as well. And Ari touched on before about the emergence of accelerated silicosis in the stone benchtop industry. Now that's got obvious relevance for us. So recently, the Thoracic Society of Australia and New Zealand and the College of Radiologists, they put out a position paper on the use of high resolution CT scans for the purposes of health surveillance in the engineered stone industry. And so in our environment, we are reviewing the health surveillance includes, the review of chest X-rays to detect silicosis in the mining environment, but ours is a different type of silicosis from natural occurring silica. However, it's obvious relevance of, perhaps different advancements or thought processes on what's an appropriate tool for health surveillance. The next part is about understanding the impact of auditing and the sheer volume of work that is actually involved in not only sending that data, but then determining the actions thereafter. So in the health space, one simply can't ignore abnormalities that are detected in audit. So for example, recently we undertook an audit of chest X-ray film, so the quality of the images themselves, and then also the accuracy of the reads by the radiologists. And there were abnormalities that were detected in the audit that were missed by the original providers. So if you have an abnormality detected in audit that perhaps shows that someone may have signs of lung cancer, we feel that you simply can't ignore that. And so we need to, liaise with the original doctors to make sure that that is followed up for the individual to protect their safety and health. So your audit methodology and processes, they really need to be clearly thought through, clearly defined and adequately resourced to be able to manage that. The next thing is, what do you prescribe and regulate and what do you not? So as I mentioned, we have to register specific types of providers with RSHQ, and we've set standards for the taking of X-rays and spirometry. But under our scheme, if abnormality is detected on chest X-ray or spirometry, then our doctors are required to follow a clinical pathway. And that clinical pathway says that those individuals need to be referred to a respiratory physician, and that respiratory physician can order things such as high-resolution CT scan, complex lab lung function tests, even biopsy if they so desired. But we don't set the standards for HRCT or biopsy or complex lung function tests. And we don't require respiratory physicians to be registered with us or undergo specific training. So therefore what we're using is we're using the respiratory physician and these other forms of tests that aren't regulated or prescribed to determine whether or not the first lot of tests and doctors' detection has actually been accurate. So in conclusion, we consider that our adoption of this belt and braces type approach, or this licensing approach, to actually be necessary, considering the systemic failure that was identified in our scheme. So we talk a lot about in the mining industries, high reliability organisations, or HRO theory. And one of the principles of HRO is about a chronic sense of unease or a preoccupation with failure. And considering what we've been through, we certainly do have that chronic sense of unease attached to health surveillance and the ongoing quality. So we feel that we need to satisfy not only ourselves, but the coal mine workers of Queensland, that the quality of the health surveillance that is being performed, that is there for their protection, safety and health, is appropriate, and that quality will be maintained both now and into the future. And that really is to support and achieve RSHQ's vision of zero serious harm. So thank you very much for your attention. I will now hand back to Ari, who I believe will now open up the room to questions.
Thanks very much, Kerry, indeed, and to Jenness. We've got a large number of questions and we're not going to get to them all, but thank you all of you for sending them in. The current most popular one, I'm going to ask Jenness to answer this one. As regulators, so we know what side of the fence this person is on, are we our own worst enemies by clumsy and duplicative licensing scheme which are neither properly enforced or reviewed? And your findings were, in fact, that there were very few that were properly reviewed or enforced indeed. Jenness.
Look, I think it's a bit mixed is the answer to that one. I'm sorry I don't have a particularly snappy rejoinder. I think it depends. There are so many variables is what we were finding between different agencies, the way they're structured, whether or not they've got the resourcing and the support to actually follow through with improving. But fundamentally, there's no systematic approach is what we were fundamentally finding, and that it's just this ongoing process that's required. I think there are, I think one of the things that regulatory agencies find, and certainly, as a regulator, we certainly find, is that you can be so busy doing the business of implementing regulation that standing back and having a bit of a critical view about what could be improved remains always a problem, and it becomes quite challenging to change that culture within your own organisation. So yeah, I think there's an element of that, but I also think, frankly, that fundamental point about needing to pursue parliamentary time and prioritisation remains really at the core of it.
Thanks, Jenness. And I'll throw the next one to both of you, and it's a question about measuring the effectiveness of a licensing scheme. What are the metrics? I'll add there, perhaps as an introduction to your answers, effectiveness is one dimension, efficiency is another, and that's one of the big issues with licensing or authorisation is efficiency. And then there are, of course, the natural justice or procedural dimensions about the fairness of the operation, which is always problematic. So in terms of evaluating a licensing scheme, I'd ask you what measures you look at with efficiency, effectiveness and fairness. Jenness first and then Kerry.
One of the things I must admit that remains a problem, frankly, is actually measuring efficiency when you're talking about the implementation and effectiveness of licensing, or in fact actually any regulation. I think I'm still waiting to find that unicorn as to how you actually can genuinely measure it, and particularly from a perspective of putting in a measure that you could use across different types of regulatory structures. So I think that remains a challenge in that space. I don't know. I have a particularly good answer for you, I'm afraid, Ari, on that one. I hope that Kerry can perhaps enlighten us.
Thanks, Jenness. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to as well. We're very new in our journey for this particular form of licensing. I can certainly say that, the auditing component is very important, as I touched on before. We're incredibly surprised at some of the results of the audits that we've done thus far. So we're in that sort of plan, do, check phase of our scheme, and it's quite surprising to still see some of the issues that are coming up out of audit in a scheme that's fairly fresh. The reviews and committee hearings were quite damaging across ourselves, the medical fraternity, etc. So one would imagine that the standards would be, quite high still this fresh on in the scheme. But I certainly think that there's still lots of learning to be done, and that any regulator really does need to take the time to check the work that you are performing, to check its adequacy, its currency. Is it working? A set and forget approach, we're a prime example of that. That's why we've had a re-emergence of a disease, an ancient disease that we thought was eradicated. So I would just certainly encourage regulators to continuously be looking at your regulation and your licensing functions, etc., to see if they are the most adequate form of regulation.
Thanks very much, Kerry. And look, one final question, and again, it'll go to you, Jenness, because I think it foreshadows a seminar coming up soon, and very much a theme in New Zealand. And your report was about how to encourage, if you like, stewarding this asset, given that it's ongoing and pervasive. As you said, it's so important to have it reviewed, sunsetted. So this is really a ripe area for regulatory stewardship, isn't it, Jenness?
Look, absolutely. I think that's a bit of a Dorothy Dix, I'm afraid, Ari. That's the fundamental thrust behind what we were finding. I think I'll touch back on what you was talking about in the beginning, when you were talking about we've got this incredibly pervasive structure of regulation that governments use as a tool, actually for really important purposes like protecting the public, and to maintain, not seeing this as actually a fundamental and important structure of government and therefore worthy of maintenance in the same way that you would maintain anything else, seems to me short-sighted at the very least, because it does come with costs. And I think one of the things that we certainly found was that notion about looking at just a straight blunt removal of red tape, it misses the point. It's not a particularly sophisticated response. The red tape is actually there for very good reasons, but it can, like everything else, always be improved and modernised. And that's actually the challenge, I think, for government and for regulators.
All right, well, thanks to you both. All of you, thank you for participating. Thank you to our speakers. Stay safe. See you next time.